Hello, this is the lesson video for lesson 2.01, Evolution and Biology. So this is the first video for Unit 2, where we're going to be learning about evolution. So here's a description about what we're going to be learning. I'm sure a lot of you guys have thought about how life forms have come to exist, how there are so many different types of animals, and so we're going to answer some of those questions, like how did life on Earth originate? Why are there so many different living things? And so those are kind of some of the essential questions, and we're going to be really centering all of that around the concept of evolution. The characteristics you see in the organisms around you are called adaptations. So I'm sure all of you guys have heard of adaptations, and we're going to go through a couple of examples of this. So we're going to go over adaptations seen in cacti, hummingbirds, even the walking stick, which you see right here. One thing that you need to really know is the definition of an adaptation. An adaptation is a characteristic, it can be either physical, chemical, or behavioral, that helps an organism survive and reproduce. So physical would be something like an organism being able to run fast, right? Something chemical might be a special type of protein that they can make in their body that will help them survive. And something behavioral will be maybe something like mating. Okay, and the key is that all of these characteristics, they have to help the organism survive and reproduce to be considered an adaptation. In this lesson, you will learn about several adaptations and see how different species are adapted to their environment. So that's the key, not just what adaptations does an organism have, but also how does that relate to where they live. So if you even look at this picture right here on the right, you can, if you look closely, you can actually see a walking stick. And obviously the adaptation for this walking stick would be that it's able to camouflage with its surroundings, meaning that it's able to hide from predators. So again, adaptations are traits that help an organism survive and reproduce, both of those things. So here's an example. So both of these right here are birds, but you see right here, this vulture actually has very long wings. And so these long wings allow the vulture to catch rising air currents, which allow them to survey an area to find dead and decaying animals. And that's pretty much what vultures eat. So its wings serve a very specific function in order for the vulture to find food. The hummingbird also has an adaptation that allows for them to find food as well. I'm pretty sure most of you guys have seen hummingbirds in person, and if you've ever seen one, you would see that their wings actually beat at a very, very fast rate. It says 80 times a second. So a motion that you actually can't even see. And what that allows it to do is it allows it to hover right in front of a flower and allows it to feed while it stays there. So clearly here we have two different birds. Their wings are both used to fly and also to feed, allow them to feed and nourish themselves. However, they both look very different because their diets are different. Each of these adaptations help these organisms live long enough to get to reproductive age. Because remember, the goal for adaptations isn't just to survive, but it's also to reproduce. There's no point in surviving unless you're able to reproduce and pass on your favorable genes. We actually call this being fit. So being fit means that you are able to survive and reproduce. Okay, so many structures in living organisms are adaptations that help those organisms carry out particular functions. Functions is another word for job. Okay, so organisms have certain jobs that they need to do in order to survive. So these adaptations are helping these organisms carry out these jobs. So we're going to look at three different examples: the pitcher plant, the four-eyed butterfly, and orchids. Okay, so here's a pitcher plant. So the pitcher plant, you might think that it would be difficult for this plant to survive because it actually lives in very poor soil. But as you can see here, it has kind of like this tube structure, right, which is actually a very unique structure that you don't see with a lot of flowers. And this structure is an adaptation that allows the pitcher plant to collect water and to attract insects into its tube. And so because the insect wanders inside, it eventually will drown in the water. Once that insect drowns, then the plant will be able to digest it as food. And so that's the way that the pitcher plant, even though it lives in very poor soil, it's still able to survive. And because it's able to survive, it's also able to reproduce, making this tubular shape part of its adaptation. Here's another example. We have the four-eyed butterfly fish. So what you can see here is clearly, I think it's pretty easy to see that this is the eye of the fish, but there's another circle right here that resembles another eye. And so obviously there's two on each side, so that's why it's called a four-eyed fish. So what biologists hypothesize is that the large eye spot right here is actually there as an adaptation that tricks predators into thinking that the fish is larger than it really is. So what that means is that imagine that instead of this just being the eye right here, imagine both of these are the eyes, and so this would be the front of the fish, and the fish automatically looks a lot bigger. And so because the fish is much larger than it really is, it leads the predators to leave the small fish alone. Okay, so this is obviously a great survival tactic, and because, again, the butterfly fish is able to survive, then that means it's also able to reproduce. I hope you guys are seeing this pattern of survival and then reproduction. That's the key to being fit in an environment. Here's our last example. This one is an orchid, but what's unique about this type of orchid is that when you look at it, you might think that you're looking at an insect as well, because like this part right here clearly looks like some sort of flower, but this part right here is a little confusing. That might resemble an insect. And so what happens is that male bees actually come up to this part of the flower and try to mate with this flower, even though it's just a flower, because they think it's a female bee. So in the process, their bodies get dusted with pollen, and then they eventually fly away and they take that pollen to the next flower. And by doing that, what they're doing is helping the flowers reproduce, allowing for the flower to continue growing in size. That way, the flower isn't just in one area, but is actually able to grow in many different types of area. So this allows for the flowers to reproduce. So that's why we consider it an adaptation. So obviously all these adaptations are very different. We looked at the tubular shape of the pitcher plants. We looked at the orchids as well as the four-eyed butterfly fish. All of them are very different, but their commonality is that all of their adaptations allow them to survive and reproduce. One really interesting thing is that organisms can develop similar adaptations even if they live very far away. So if we look at these three birds right here, we see that they all have this long and narrow beak, right? Not all birds have that, but these three do. And even though they live in different places, like this one's from Trinidad, this one's from South America, and this one's from Africa, all of them have similar beaks. And the reason why is because they eat similar things. Each of these birds feed on nectar, which is a sugary substance produced by flowers. And so it requires them to reach deep into the flower in order to get their food source. So these long and skinny beaks end up being very handy. So even though they live on different continents, they're able to evolve a similar adaptation because they have the same food source, which is nectar. These birds are actually not closely related to one another, but their beaks are similar because their food source is similar. So this is another really important connection. Adaptations, there must be a relationship between adaptations and the environment. How does the environment impact adaptations? Okay, so that's going to be something that we're going to be looking at. Okay, so the environment, what it does is it shapes the needs of an organism. So the environment would be things like what the organism eats, right? The climate, all of those different aspects that are important for survival. And so the environment basically determines what the organism needs in order to survive and reproduce. So when we look at these desert plants of two unrelated families, we see one here and one here. They're clearly from two unrelated families, but they have similar adaptations, which include spines to deter predators and thick stems that store water. So even though these two environments are thousands of miles apart, if the environments are very similar, right? So even though they're very far, they're similar, you can expect to see similarities in the adaptation. So we went over different types of adaptations before, physical, chemical, and also behavioral. So remember, animal behavior can also be considered an adaptation. So I'm sure all of you guys have seen this fish before, right? It's Nemo, or a clownfish, right? And even from the movie, you know that clownfish live in an anemone. And anemone are very interesting organisms because they have stinging cells on the surface of their bodies, and they use it to kill prey. So obviously you wouldn't want to be around something that's going to sting or harm you. And so what that does is it keeps predators away and also allows them to get food themselves. However, why do we always see the clownfish in anemones? The reason why is because this is the clownfish's adaptation. They secrete mucus on their skin, and that allows them to resist the anemone stinging cells. So obviously the anemone is still stinging the clownfish, but the clownfish cannot feel it because of that special mucus that they have in order to protect themselves. And so they don't feed on the anemone, so they're not eating or harming the anemone in any way, but they do rely on the anemone for protection, right? So that goes into survival, right? From fish that might otherwise eat them. So obviously, if it helps them survive, then it'll also help them reproduce. Okay. In this case, the mucus is not only just a chemical adaptation, but it's also a behavioral adaptation because the clownfish actually reside in the anemones. They live there. Another type of behavioral adaptation is called migration. So I'm sure all of you guys have heard of migration. And one really popular example of this is the seasonal movement of animals such as birds, which you see right here. And so birds actually migrate every fall, and the reason why is because plant and insect food sources become scarce. And what that means is what is in danger? Their food supply is low, so that means if they stay there, their survival will also be low, right? Their survival rates will be low. And so adaptations, remember, help with survival as well as reproduction. And so the adaptation that birds have is they leave that area. And where do they go to? They go to warmer places to make sure that they have enough food to survive and thus reproduce. When it gets warmer, so like in the spring, they go ahead and go back. And so these behaviors are ways in which the organisms are adapted to live and survive, and most importantly, again, is live long enough to reproduce. Another example of a behavioral adaptation is the way that birds actually fly in this V formation that you see right here. And the reason why this is an adaptation is because it helps conserve energy. The bird at the tip of the V, so right here, is using significantly more energy than the rest of the birds. So it really benefits all of the birds on the sides right here. And this also keeps the birds very organized and allows the leader, which tends to be at the tip of the V, to really direct and determine what direction is best for the birds to go. So the last concept we're going to be looking at is the difference between adaptations and adapting. So we talked about adaptations being a characteristic or behavior that makes an organism fit, which means survive and reproduce in its environment. However, we do need to be careful with when we use the word adapt. It's actually different than adaptation. So here's a good example. So if it starts to rain and you choose to get out of the rain, then you are adapting to a change in your environment, right? Because this is a certain type of behavior. You might say that you adapt when you put on a coat to go out in the cold. When you use the word adapt in that way, it is accurate, but it's different. So one clear way to kind of distinguish between the two words is to think of adaptations to be structural, chemical, and behavioral, just like we talked about, and that they are possessed by an organism, or that an organism has it. It's built into the life of the organism, which means that they are born with it. It's in its DNA. Okay, so these are things that organisms are born with, whereas if you put a coat on, just like this boy here, you are not born with a coat, right? And so the coat itself is not an adaptation. However, this boy also can keep warm because he has a small and stocky build, which helps retain heat. That would be something that we would consider an adaptation. So that all leads us to the theory of evolution. So how do we have organisms that are so well adapted to their environment? How does that happen? Is it just magically that all of these organisms just are perfectly formed exactly to their environment? And so that's kind of an interesting question. Because as we all know, even though we haven't lived for a very long time, we know that the environment doesn't always stay exactly the same. So we ask the questions like, how did all of these adaptations arise or come about? And how do living things become so well adapted to the environment that they live in? So when we talked about the clownfish, how did the clownfish get that mucus, right? How did it form that mucus? What could have possibly happened in the past to give rise to the unique pitcher plant, remember, that had that shape like a pitcher, or that orchid to give an appearance like that insect? And so scientists have come up with an explanation called the theory of evolution. And evolution, as a broad definition, is the change over time. But in biology, we specifically look at the change of living things over time. And that's going to be our focus for this unit. So to summarize lesson 2.01, evolution and biology, the most important thing that you need to know are what are adaptations. Adaptations are characteristics that help organisms survive and reproduce. Remember, and both of these things equal being fit. These adaptations are characteristics that can either be structural, chemical, or behavioral. And again, we'll be going over more specific examples of this in the later in the unit. So important vocabulary that you need to know. Adaptation, again, I feel like we've said it 1,000 times, is a physical, chemical, or behavioral characteristic that helps an organism survive and reproduce. And evolution, which will be our focus for the remaining part of the unit, will be the change of living things over time.